Much. It was Paul that was doing most of the talking, but basically, what he explained was that George Martin had explained to the Beatles back in the studio that sound frequencies could be used um, to influence a crowd of people, to make them behave at the will of the person controlling the frequencies. And Paul was talking about this, saying if you turn he what he did basically, he said he remembers George Martin talking to the Beatles back in the day about how Adolf Hitler used sound frequencies in front of his rallies, where thousands and thousands of people would turn up to see Hitler. This was in the pre-war years, I'm guessing, when his popularity was at its ultimate peak, I suppose. And he would turn up to these rallies. And what George Martin was saying to Paul and the Beatles back in the 60s was, you could, with the aid of a sound frequency, what Hitler's people would do before Hitler got to the podium, they would turn the sound frequency up so high you couldn't actually hear the sound frequency. The crowd couldn't hear it. But what it would do to their nervous system and to their bodies physically is it would make them feel physically sick. It would make them feel ill, like they were going to throw up, give them headaches, the rest of it. But they wouldn't know why. The crowd wouldn't know why, because they couldn't hear it. All they could do was feel this sound frequency. And then as soon as Hitler came onto the podium, the sound level would be turned right down to the lowest bass level. And this would cause a feeling of elation amongst the crowd, and it would make them feel happy, and it would make them, and they would see. And so you mix that with them seeing Hitler on the podium with his ability for drama, and it would make them excited. It would make them excitable. It would make them almost like Beatles fans, if you like. So although they didn't say it in the documentary, I did wonder, because many people over the years, and I'm talking about psychologists, sociologists, have tried to work out, what is it about the Beatles that made fans scream? What was it that made them do this? I spoke to an author a few years back who wrote a book about the Beatles, a mainstream book, and he wrote one book, and it was called I Was There, and it was about the Beatles, and it was about the Beatles performing live in concert, and it was basically the story of the Beatles during their touring years, but told from the perspective of fans who went to the concerts. And I asked him, did you get any feeling or any consensus as to why these people screamed at the concerts? And he says, funny you should say that, because he did ask these then youngsters at these concerts why they screamed, and they couldn't explain why they screamed. They just said, some of them even said that before they went into the concert hall, they promised themselves that it wouldn't be, because they'd seen the footage on TV or whatever, they've seen the fans screaming, and they said, oh, I'm not going to do that, I'm not stupid. Screaming, what do you want to do that? And then they'd walk in, and it was like something took hold of them, and they began screaming. In fact, screaming more than probably the person next to them. So from walking in saying, I'm not going to do it, they were going in and doing it. Now, no one's really come up with an answer why people did this. These witnesses that this author interviewed don't have a reason for it. They just said that they got caught in the moment and they just couldn't help themselves. Now, what if, like Hitler, okay, sound frequencies were being used at concerts in order to turn the gain up, if you like, on the sound frequency, in order to gain this kind of excitable mania from the public. It's just an idea. It's just an idea to throw out there. Who knows?
And that McGill, I could develop this whole thing, maybe make it make sense. McGill was connected with Tavistock, okay?
Yeah.
And some of the psychiatrists who were programming patients, but I think particularly children at McGill in the 1950s, were the same psychiatrists that, they would have known either known or been the same people that were at Tavistock. I mean, some of them were. Some of them, there was. So there were a number of them, and one of them was my father's psychiatrist, Peter Roper. And Dr. Peter Roper, was an Air Force pilot who was shot down over France as a young man, and appeared in a famous documentary, British documentary called A Diary of Timothy, by Humphrey Jennings. I don't know if that means anything to you, but Humphrey Jennings was making documentaries after the war in England about the regeneration of the of the British people, through music and dance. One of the ways that that England got back on its feet was through music halls and dance. There was an entertainment music connection, and part of what was going on at McGill in the center of Montreal, which had been the jazz capital of Canada and North America, well, like New Orleans and New York, was that they were programming artists and musicians in particular, because the Air Force owned EMI, the recording studio in London where the Stones and the Beatles recorded. Mm-hmm. And they had developed a form of mind control programming using electronic signals, right? And they were expanding that. And the top psychiatrist, Dr. Cameron, at the Allen Memorial, used to talk and write about how rock and roll music could be the vector of mental illness. He said you could create rock stars who were mentally ill, and then they could spread mental illness to a whole population, which was really his goal, was to make everyone schizophrenic and controllable through drugs and different forms of electronics and so on. So you see, you can really make a connection between the electronic music in London and this kind of satellite hospital in Montreal, where I believe that, well, I don't know if I should say this, but I believe that they flew people like Jagger, the young kids who were selected. He grew up in Dartford, right, military Air Force base, where they trained the pilots, right?
Yep.
That flew over France. Very big Air Force base, right? And Montreal had a little Air Force base near where I grew up called Cartierville, and I think they just flew Air Force planes between those two places. And I think that he and probably others were part of the mind control. They come like for special programs in the summertime. So I think that's where I met him, and I think my family knew him. But he was a kid. He wasn't Mick Jagger. He was Mike.
Yeah.
And he was this little redheaded kid.
And basically, it's a book that goes into the various ways in which humans and animals can have their minds controlled and bent to the will of the people that are doing this. Now, with regards to what you were saying there, with regards to Adorno, I've got a quote from Sargent here. This is from his book. And I quote, "Recordings of the human brain show that it is particularly sensitive to rhythmic stimulation by percussion and bright light, among other things, and certain rates of rhythm can build up recordable abnormalities of brain function and explosive states of tension, sufficient even to produce convulsive fits in predisposed subjects. Furthermore, it is easier to disorganize the normal function of the brain by attacking simultaneously with several strong rhythms played in different tempos." Now, before I stop talking about William Sargent, something else I talk about in the video briefly is some allegations that have been put forward regarding William Sargent. There's a website that you can go take a look at. It's run by a character by the name of Redwell Trabant. It's called The Beatles Conspiracy. Now, there's an article on there, and I think it's in an article about MK Ultra and the Beatles, but I might be wrong. But there's a quote there from an anonymous contributor who claims that in London in the 60s, they were a young teenager at the time, and they were actually a human guinea pig. That's what they claim. They were a human guinea pig that were being fed various forms of drugs in order to see what the effects were. And this was being kind of like supported by the British police. Now, 3 people were doing these MK Ultra tests on this anonymous person. One of those was Dr. Richard Asher, who was the father of Jane Asher, Jane Asher, the actress, the English actress, who in the 1960s was for most of the 1960s was dating Paul McCartney, was actually engaged to him for a time. And indeed, Paul McCartney did live with the Asher family at their home between 63 and 66. He was one of the doctors alleged to be have been taking part in these MK Ultra experiments. The other one was Emmanuel Miller, a reported Tavistock Clinic author and psychiatrist. And the other one was William Sargent. So,
I think that's a really important link up, because essentially what the crux of the matter is here is that in the 1950s, they were doing all of these experiments, and a lot of them were done on people who had shell shock, people who had come in for maybe mild depression and then got locked away in a psychiatric hospital where they was doing all of these experiments where they was using LSD and all of these newly found psychotropic drugs. And they were trying to essentially figure out, how can we program someone to make, for example, a Manchurian candidate, or to make somebody just bend to our will. And then it cannot be a coincidence that just after that, we had this mass movement that was filled with all of these characters that were working on these ideas, including the rhythmic music, like you said, people who were analyzing how can we get a crowd to behave in a certain way. And then that scene all of a sudden gets influxed with all of these drugs that were just being used a few years before for MK Ultra, and that was LSD, which coincidentally was actually discovered in Basel in Switzerland, which is where the Bank of International Settlements is right now. So I like that link up too. But is that how you frame it as well, Matt? That essentially MK Ultra and what they was doing on an individual level, it was like, right, can we do this on a mass scale? And that's what the 60s was really the first wave of.
Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us, only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for. No immigration too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us. Possessions. I wonder if we can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood and sisterhood.